He just wanted a milkshake. A small thing, really. Something any kid should be able to enjoy without fear. But on that cold afternoon, inside a quiet diner with red leather seats and the smell of coffee hanging in the air, something happened that would change more than one life forever. People say evil always announces itself with a roar, but this one started with a whisper of laughter that didn't sound right. It was sharp, mean, and carried across the diner like a cold wind. The boy, no older than 10, looked up, unsure if he'd done something wrong. He hadn't. His only mistake was being there, being seen. The man in the black leather jacket didn't like what he saw. His stare was the kind that made the air heavy, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." And in a moment of rage and ignorance, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The sound that followed made everyone freeze, a slap so loud it silenced the diner. For a few seconds, time stopped. The boy stood still, his cheek red, his eyes filled not with tears, but confusion. The people watching didn't move, some in shock, others in quiet guilt. No one spoke up. No one helped. And as silence took over, the man smirked, thinking it was over. But it wasn't. Because just then, the bell over the door rang, a deep chime that cut through the tension like thunder before a storm. A man in a black suit stepped inside. Calm. Controlled. His presence alone made the air shift. Nobody knew who he was. But the bully would soon learn. The boy looked up. And for the first time, he smiled. What came next wasn't just revenge. It was justice. The kind that doesn't need a courtroom. The kind that changes everything. This is what happens when hate crosses the wrong line. Would you dare to stay and see what justice looks like when the victim's father is the most feared man in the city? It was one of those crisp autumn mornings that made the city feel calm, almost kind. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted coffee drifting from the corner diner on Maple Street, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. The red vinyl booths, the clinking cups, the soft hum of an old jukebox. It was comfort for everyone who came through the door. Everyone. Except those who were reminded they didn't quite belong. Malik Johnson was only 10, but his eyes carried more awareness than most grown men. His mother used to say he was old in the soul, quiet, observant, always watching the world with a kind of cautious curiosity. Every morning before school, he would stop by that diner to pick up a chocolate milkshake, his little ritual. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes named Doris, always had one waiting for him before the first bell. He'd walk in, nod, politely count the coins he had saved from helping his neighbors with small chores and sit by the window, the same booth every time. He liked watching the street come alive, cars rushing, people crossing, the world moving fast while he sipped slow. It was his peaceful start to every day, a few minutes of calm before facing the noise of school. His father, Marcus Johnson, was a name people whispered. But not around Malik. To him, his father was just Dad, a man who taught him to stand tall, to treat people right, and to never raise a hand unless it was to help. What Malik didn't know was that his father's calm strength came from a world far darker than he'd ever seen. Behind the sharp suits and quiet demeanor was a man with power, the kind of power that could make entire streets go silent when he walked by. But Marcus had kept that life far from his son. He wanted Malik to grow up untouched by fear, to believe the world could be kind. And so the boy grew up innocent, believing that if he did good, good would return to him. That morning was no different. Malik's mother kissed him on the forehead, told him to keep his jacket zipped, and reminded him not to talk to strangers. He smiled, grabbed his little backpack, and stepped out into the world with a lightness that only children know. When he entered the diner, the air was warm and familiar. He climbed onto his usual stool, feet dangling above the floor. Doris greeted him with a grin. "Your favorite, honey," she said, sliding the milkshake across the counter. Malik smiled shyly, thanked her, and wrapped his small hands around the cold glass. Across the room, a group of men sat in one of the booths. Loud laughter, heavy boots, and the faint smell of alcohol even this early in the day. One of them, a man in a black leather jacket, leaned back in his seat watching the boy. His eyes narrowed, not out of curiosity, but something uglier. To him, Malik's presence was an intrusion. The man's name was Dean, ex-military, short-tempered, and quick to pick a fight with anything that made him feel small. And people like Malik did that without trying. The boy's quiet confidence, his politeness, his peacefulness, it was everything Dean had lost in himself. As Malik sipped his milkshake, humming softly to himself, Dean's smirk spread. He nudged his friends, muttering something under his breath. They chuckled, the kind of laughter that wasn't friendly. Doris noticed but said nothing. She'd seen this kind of thing before, and every time she did, it tore at her conscience a little more. Outside, a black sedan slowed down near the diner. Inside, Marcus Johnson was on his way to a business meeting. Or at least that's what everyone assumed. In truth, his business often involved making sure the wrong kind of people didn't hurt the right kind of ones. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant reminding him about a call in 10 minutes. He ignored it, glancing toward the diner window. Through the glass, he saw his son sipping his drink. He smiled. But then something caught his attention. The man in the leather jacket, leaning forward, his face twisted with something unpleasant. Marcus's jaw tightened. Instinct told him something wasn't right. Inside, the laughter grew louder. Malik tried to ignore it, focusing on his milkshake. Doris noticed his discomfort and gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't mind them, sweetheart," she whispered, but her voice trembled slightly. Dean stood up. The diner went quieter. His boots echoed as he walked toward the counter, the air shifting around him. Malik's small shoulders stiffened, his fingers gripping the glass. The man's shadow fell over him, swallowing the light that streamed through the window. Outside, Marcus opened his car door, but then froze. Through the glass, he saw Dean towering over his son. His instincts screamed to move, but he waited, watching, assessing, calculating. Inside, Doris spoke softly. "Sir, please sit down." "He's just a kid." Dean didn't listen. He bent slightly, his face close to Malik's. His voice was low, but venomous. Malik didn't respond, just stared down at his milkshake, trying not to make things worse. And then, Dean's hand twitched. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Marcus stepped inside, calm, controlled, every step measured. Nobody knew who he was, not yet. He stood near the entrance, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Doris saw him but didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. Malik felt something shift. He looked up and saw his father standing there. The man in the leather jacket didn't. Not yet. The setup was complete. The world had no idea what it was about to witness. How one act of hate, one moment of cruelty would unravel everything. Because in that diner on that ordinary morning, evil had picked the wrong child to humiliate, and justice was already walking through the door. The diner's stillness feels unnatural, like the pause between lightning and thunder. The boy's small hand tightens around the milkshake glass, condensation threading down his fingers, pooling on the counter like a slow clock. The leather-jacketed man crowds the space, his breath heavy with bravado and bitterness, drawing a circle of heat around a child who wanted nothing more than sweetness and quiet. Eyes lift from plates, forks halt mid-air. Some faces show worry, some curiosity, a few that hardened long ago into apathy. The kind waitress hovers near the coffee pots, her kindness wrestling with fear, her heart racing faster than the drip of the machine. The first push is not physical. It is the push of presence and posture, of deliberate invasion, of a stare stretched like a wire across the counter. The boy lowers his gaze, the way children learn to do when safety depends on shrinking. The man takes his cue from that shrinking and grows bolder. He leans in, says words he knows will sting, words inherited from a long line of cowards who needed someone smaller to step on. The boy hears them, absorbs them, feels them settle like stones in his chest. He does not answer. His mother taught him that silence can be a shield, and his father taught him that composure is a weapon. He uses both, but his hands still tremble. A tension coils across the room. The man's friends, stirred by the scent of spectacle, straighten in their booth. A patron near the window pretends to read a newspaper, eyes floating over the edge every few seconds, guilt hidden behind flimsy paper. Another patron reaches for a phone, not to call for help, but to record. The world has become a theater where suffering is a show and the audience buys tickets with attention. The boy becomes the stage, then the leather-jacketed man escalates. He knocks his knuckles against the counter beside the milkshake, a small percussion that declares dominance. The glass rattles. The boy startles. The milkshake swirls into a small vortex. The straw quivers like a reed in wind. The waitress steps closer, as if proximity alone could intervene. Her eyes slide briefly toward the door, where a figure in a dark suit has appeared, unannounced and unmoved. The suited man stands like a monolith, posture easy, gaze steady, presence so controlled it feels inevitable. He does not interrupt. He witnesses. The man in the jacket senses attention and performs harder. He advances in cruel little increments, savoring the spectacle. He wants fear to flower. He wants power to taste like sugar on his tongue. He wants proof that his world, where some people sit at the center and others hover at the margins, still holds. The boy tries to retreat into stillness, but stillness cannot protect skin when cruelty decides it owns the room. The insult lands. The hand follows. The sound is a crack against porcelain air. Shock slaps the diner into silence. The boy swallows the burn in his cheek, fighting the reflex to cry. Tears would hand the man a trophy. He steadies his breathing. He imagines the train set at home, the carriages clicking into place, predictable and safe, the rhythm that calms his mind at night. He holds the image like a lighthouse. The waitress moves now, not with confrontation, but with care, edging a napkin toward the child, as if a square of paper could possibly dress a wound made of history. The leather-jacketed man laughs without humor. He crowns himself with the sound. Behind them, the door chime mutters its small bell and closes again. The suited man has entered the current of the room. He walks the length of the checkered floor with the unhurried conviction of a tide. People sense a change they cannot name. The boy senses it too, his shoulders loosening by a fraction, a seam of relief unspooling just enough to breathe. He does not call out. He does not have to. Some bonds are telegraph lines. They carry messages without words. The father's eyes take an inventory. He captures faces, angles, exits, distances. He notes the heavy salt shaker within the bully's reach, the coffee carafe near the waitress's elbow, the weight distribution in the bully's stance. Calculation rides beneath composure. Another man might storm, but storms advertise themselves and lose the element of weather. This man chooses pressure over noise. He chooses inevitability over raw force. He anchors himself 3 paces away and lets silence do its work. The bully, drunk on attention, does not sense the undertow. He paces, prowls, puffs. He wants a reaction he can dominate. When none arrives, he grows more frantic, like a fisherman yanking a line with no catch. He directs a string of dehumanizing claims at the boy, stitching the child into a story he did not write. In that story, the boy is lesser. In that story, the diner is a boarder. In that story, the bully is guardian of a gate that never belonged to him. The father feels the old ache in his chest, the one that woke the first time he saw his son recoil from a stranger's stare. He swallows it, corrals it, saves it for when it will have purpose. Someone at a back booth clears a throat as if to intervene, then retreats into a safe slouch. Another patron turns the sign of conscience inward and pretends he never considered standing up. Good people often wait for perfect moments to be brave, and perfect moments rarely arrive. The waitress finds the courage others misplace. She angles her body between the boy and the bully, not as a shield that could stop a blow, but as a witness who refuses to look away. The bully's lips peel back, a show of teeth that confuses menace with strength. He takes another step. The father's hand lifts an inch, no more, a gesture small as a breath. It lands on the counter beside the milkshake, palm flat, fingers splayed with relaxed authority. The bully catches the motion and follows the line of the wrist to the cuff, from the cuff to the watch, from the watch to the face. Recognition does not come yet. What comes is irritation that the center of the stage has shifted by degrees toward a man who does not seem to audition for it. The father's gaze does not waver. In that gaze, there is no pleading, no rage, only a calm certainty that rattles the bully more than anger would. Tension spreads across the tiled floor, a film of oil waiting for a spark. The boy's heartbeat steadies against the drum of fear. He finds his father's eyes and holds them, drawing strength like breath. The father flicks his attention around the room again. He sees the camera phone lifted just enough to catch faces. He knows footage can become a narrative that eats the truth and spits out something useful to the wrong people. He knows stories get edited to absolve bystanders and blame victims. He thinks of his own story, acquired over years in rooms without windows and cities without second chances, a story that taught him to control outcomes because no one else would. He does not want that story to stain his son's childhood. Yet here it is knocking. The bully speaks again, volume rising, temper flaring at the audacity of a man who stares back without flinch. He jabs a finger near the boy's shoulder, the gesture theatrically mean. The father studies the finger and catalogs the calluses. He can tell the bully is a man who lifts more pride than weight, a man whose cruelty is a costume stitched from insecurity. He recognizes the type because he has, on rare occasions, hired or broken men like this. He feels the familiar temptation to solve the problem the way his world taught him to solve problems. He resists, for now. A siren wails somewhere far away, a thread of sound that does not belong to this moment but finds it anyway. The bully flinches, then recovers, annoyed that anything might threaten the spotlight. He points toward the door as if claiming the diner as territory, as if drawing imaginary lines on linoleum could give him ownership of the people inside. The father appraises the gesture like a surveyor marking coordinates. He files away the detail without moving. The child thinks of rules learned in classrooms and kitchens. He thinks of how to appear small to avoid harm, how to make his voice careful, how to step around words he knows will trigger adults who expect submission. He has been taught to be polite, to be gentle, to be twice as good for half the grace. He has also been taught to know his worth. The two lessons clash in his chest like weather systems. He feels both pressure and pride. He straightens a little on the stool. The bully notices and mistakes dignity for defiance. Cruelty, when starved, eats anything that looks like courage. The father shifts his weight. The entire diner leans with him, though no one moves. The waitress's eyes bounce between the men, her knuckles whitening around a cup she has not served. She wonders how many times in her life she has watched harm inch across a room while hope tried to keep up. She decides she will not be the woman who stays still when a child is in danger. She takes half a step forward. The father meets her eyes and gives the faintest shake of the head, not a command, a promise. She understands and holds where she is, trembling but anchored. The bully slaps the milkshake off the counter. Glass explodes in a splash of cold sweetness, shards skidding across tile, chocolate stripes stitching chaos into the floor. Gasps whip around the room. The boy's breath catches on a jagged edge of shock. Grief washes over him for something simple and good that has been destroyed because someone needed proof of power. The father does not look at the mess. He looks at his son's face and watches innocence lose a tooth. The next beat arrives faster than memory can catalog. The bully, high on the chemical of cruelty, reaches for the boy's shoulder with a rough, grabbing motion. The father crosses the remaining distance in a blur that reads as calm, but moves like weather, intercepting hand before it lands. He does not strike. He does not shout. He simply places his own hand where the bully's intended to land and applies a kind of pressure that is both warning and prophecy. For a moment, the bully is confronted not by a rival, but by his reflection in the unwavering stillness of a man who will not be moved. The bully yanks back, scoffing to conceal the small animal in his eyes. A booth of onlookers leans inward, the spell of passivity weakening. A man near the door, emboldened by proximity to exit, murmurs a suggestion about calling the police. Another counters quietly that police do not always arrive as protectors for boys who look like this one. The truth of that floats above the pies in their glass domes, bitter as the coffee cooling on warmers. The father hears it and catalogs timelines. Intervention must end quickly, or the next chapter will be written by people who do not know how to read this child's safety. The bully squares his shoulders, marshaling his friends with a glance. They stand, heavy boots thudding in imperfect unison, a clumsy chorus. The room divides the way rooms always do. Those who move toward danger and those who back away from it. The father makes a calculation he hoped to avoid. He considers negotiation, then discards it as a waste of a precious commodity. Time. He considers spectacle, then discards it as a gift to cowards. He chooses demonstration. He moves the boy gently, behind him with a small nudge that communicates love more clearly than words. The boy understands and slides off the stool, angling himself near the waitress, who becomes a wall made of care. The father turns his body, presenting less surface area, aligning hips and shoulders into a geometry of defense rather than attack. He speaks without speaking, every line of him declaring that the child behind him is not furniture to be rearranged by strangers. The bully, incapable of reading that language, advances. The first friend tries to circle wide, aiming to flank. The father steps just enough to break the angle and meets the man's attempt with a controlled redirection, not a blow. The friend stumbles, momentum stealing his balance, pride scraping the floor louder than his boots. Another reaches for the father's sleeve, expecting struggle and finding instead a sudden absence as the father pivots away, inviting an overextension that lands the friend against the counter with a clang. None of it looks dramatic. It looks inevitable, like gravity doing math. The bully mistakes his friend's clumsiness for evidence that the suited man is lucky rather than skilled. He lunges. The father accepts the lunge as if receiving a poorly wrapped package, then returns it to sender with the kind of efficiency that ends conversations. The bully stumbles back, surprised to find the room not tilting in his favor. Rage scrapes through him like sandpaper. He reaches instinctively toward his waistband for an advantage he does not find. The father, who has been tracking that hand, since the bell on the door rang, already knows what is and is not there. In the corner, the recording phone tilts, trying to capture angles that will go viral. The father finally looks straight into that lens. The phone wavers and drops a degree, as if the person holding it suddenly remembers this is not entertainment. Conscience, bullied into hiding by spectacle, takes a trembling step back toward the light. The door opens again. A pair of uniforms enters on the gust of a rumor. Someone called from outside after catching sight of the scuffle through glass, eager to be helpful or right or both. The uniforms scan the room and fix on the boy first, then on the man shielding him, then on the larger man with the leather jacket rubbing at a new ache. Stereotypes, trained like dogs, sprint to their marks. The father feels the room tilt under a different gravity now. He knows too well how quickly stories congeal around assumptions, how fast a victim becomes a suspect when the skin map matches a script written by fear. The waitress steps forward before the wrong narrative can harden. Her voice carries the weight of a witness who refuses to be erased. She names what happened. She points to the shattered milkshake, the swelling on the child's cheek, the sequence of cruelty. The officers listen in the practiced way of people who have been told to be neutral in rooms where neutrality is a luxury. One officer glances at the bully with a reflexive sympathy reserved for men who look like brothers or uncles. The other glances at the boy with something like protective shame, as if apologizing in advance for a system that keeps getting it wrong. The father lowers his hands to a non-threatening position, not because he feels threatened, but because he refuses to give the world a screenshot that could be weaponized against his son. He asks no favors. He waits for a question that cannot be misheard. The bully finds his voice again and begins to construct a fiction, layering it with confidence, banking on the benevolent inertia that often carries certain storytellers further than facts do. The waitress interrupts with a firmness that fractures the fantasy. The room exhales. The officers look again, this time seeing not the performance, but the pattern. One officer moves toward the boy, kneeling, making eye level, asking with careful body language if he is hurt. The boy nods once, then shakes his head, then nods again. A child's attempt to make grown-up choices about appearing strong. The father watches, heart threading itself through a needle's eye. He does not want pity for his son. He wants respect for him. He wants the world to adjust itself around the truth that this child's safety is non-negotiable. The officers separate the bully and his friends for questions. The father notices a new problem blooming near the door. A man in a suit that does not belong to this neighborhood, peering in with the appraising interest of someone who deals in news or in rumors for a living. The father knows how quickly a local incident can become currency, how a headline can make a child into a symbol that strangers will argue over while forgetting he is a boy with a train set and a mother who sings in the kitchen. The father does not intend to surrender his son to the hunger of narratives pushed by outsiders. He sends a silent signal to someone unseen, and the suited observer thinks better of the story he planned to mine. For a moment, it seems the room will hold, that decency will prevail with paperwork and a complaint filed, that the bully will be escorted away to face a consequence commensurate with his harm. Then the other gravity reasserts itself. The bully invokes connections. He invokes a relative with a badge in a nearby precinct, a neighbor on a city council, a bar owner who donates to the right fundraisers. He smirks in a way that says consequence is for other people. The officers falter. The pause stretches. The father watches the pause the way a sailor watches a sudden shift in wind. He knows what it means when institutions hesitate. He has built an empire in the space where they do. The boy senses the slippage, too dense but perceptible, like black ice underfoot. His stomach drops, not because he fears the bully now, he does not, but because he recognizes the larger foe, a machine that mutes harm when the harm fits a familiar face. He looks at his father and sees the calm that comes before a choice. He remembers a lesson taught without words. Power is not volume. Power is control. He steadies himself because he knows what comes next will echo. The door chime rings again. Two men enter who do not belong to the police and do not belong to the bully. They belong to the suited man in the center of the room. They belong to a world that has rules of its own, rules designed not for fairness but for order, rules that can feel like justice when wielded in defense of the right person. They do not posture. They take up positions with practiced elegance, placing themselves between the family and any threat the room still harbors. The father does not turn to acknowledge them. He does not need to. Presence is its own punctuation. Fear, when cornered, grows teeth. The bully senses his legend shrinking and tries to make it swell with one last surge of bravado. He steps toward the father, asserting a narrative of dominance he no longer believes. The officers raise hands, urging calm. The father lifts his chin by a fraction, accepting responsibility for the next movement of the world inside this diner. He has given restraint every chance to win. Restraint has not. He decides, not for vengeance, but for certainty. He decides for the boy who will carry this moment into future rooms. He decides for the people witnessing, whose next choices will be shaped by what they saw here today. He decides for the waitress who stood up when others sat down. He decides with a clarity that is not anger, though anger stands nearby like a loyal dog. He steps forward into the bully's space with a precision that looks almost gentle. He establishes a boundary with the invisible authority of a man who draws borders with consequences. His voice, quiet, measured, moves through the air like a blade without flourish. He names the line that was crossed. He names the price of crossing it again. He does not raise a hand. He does not need to. The room understands. The uniforms understand. The bully understands last. The officers, seeing a resolution unfamiliar to their training but not hostile to safety, make their move. They inform the bully he is leaving. They place hands that are firm and professional. The bully sputters, but the sputter dies against the wall of inevitability. He spits out a final slur that lands in the air like ash while being escorted toward the door. The father turns his body so the child will not have to breathe it. The boy, sheltered from the word, hears only the footfalls. The door opens to daylight and cool air. The bully is guided outside. People who had paused on the sidewalk to watch shift with the spectacle, some glancing at the boy with sympathy, others with the hungry curiosity of those who taste gossip like salt. The father remains inside, keeping his son's world small for a few more seconds. The waitress wipes the counter with shaking hands, sweeping shards into a pan with fierce tenderness, as if cleaning could undo what cruelty broke. The boy looks at the ruined milkshake and feels grief that is larger than ice cream. He feels how fragile peace can be when someone decides to smash it. He also feels something rise in him that is not bitterness but bone. He stands a little taller without meaning to. He understands that he has changed. The father feels the change too and mourns it. He also honors it. He signals to the men at the door. One disappears and returns with a new milkshake, chocolate-rich and cold in a fresh glass placed gently on the counter. The gesture is not a replacement. It is a reclamation. The boy wraps his hands around it and closes his eyes for a heartbeat. He drinks, and the sweetness does not cancel the sting, but it refuses to let the sting define the day. Outside, a car idles where the bully shouts empty threats into a void that no longer echoes. The officers do their work. Papers are filled, numbers exchanged, statements recorded. Inside, the father thanks the waitress with a nod that carries gratitude deeper than words, and she nods back with a smile that does not reach her eyes because she is still shaking. The patrons resume movements, but gentler now, plates handled with care, voices softened as if the room itself were bruised. The boy finishes half the milkshake and pushes it toward the waitress so she can set it aside for later. He adjusts his backpack and reaches for his father's hand. The father offers it, strong and steady, and the boy takes it. They walk toward the door together, past the place on the floor where chocolate stains refuse to vanish completely. The father pauses. He looks at the stains as if they are coordinates on a map he will not forget. They step into daylight that feels both brighter and colder. A small crowd lingers, eyes curious, phones resting like sleeping snakes. The father shields his son with his body and his presence. A long black car rolls to the curb, the door opened by a man with the posture of a sentinel. The father hesitates a fraction of a second, calculating what lesson this departure will teach. He does not want to brand his son with notoriety. He does not want to hide either. He chooses the middle road, head high, stride unhurried, touch reassuring. Before the father allows the door to close, he scans the block and makes one final choice. Somewhere, the bully's friends will retell this story in a way that keeps them from drowning in their own shame. Somewhere, a forum will twist facts to fit a comforting narrative. Somewhere, a father unlike him will tell his child that the boy brought it on himself. He cannot police every story, but he can shape the one that matters most, the one his son will carry. He kneels just enough to meet his child's eyes without bending the boy down. He touches the unmarked cheek with the back of his fingers, the touch barely there, and straightens. The boy nods, understanding the ritual of reassurance is complete. They enter the car. The door closes on the scene behind them. The engine hums. The city moves. The diner exhales. The waitress leans against the counter, suddenly tired. The officers finish their paperwork and step into sun. The crowd disperses, arguments already forming in private texts. The boy's half-finished milkshake sweats onto a saucer, a small comet melting in a universe that keeps spinning. In the back seat, the boy watches the world slide by, one block at a time. He asks nothing aloud. His father answers anyway in the language of presence, a palm resting on a knee, a shoulder angled close, a gaze that checks mirrors and horizons with equal care. The boy trusts the silence, but inside he is stacking questions like books he will read when ready. He wonders why strangers need to hurt. He wonders how to make sure the next child does not feel what he just felt. He wonders what his father carries that lets him turn storms into still water. The car slows near a school building with walls painted in cheerful colors. Children stream through the doors, the mess and miracle of ordinary days resuming. The father considers sending his son inside to reclaim routine. He decides against it. Healing requires time, not denial. They drive on. They pass a park where young men sprint the perimeter, lungs pulling in the same air that just witnessed cruelty. They pass a mural honoring names that never should have become slogans. The boy reads the names in his head and feels the heavy company of history. Somewhere between one traffic light and the next, the father makes a second decision. The bully will not learn the right lesson from handcuffs alone. Systems bend too easily around men like him, then snap back into old shapes. This will require a different curriculum, one that teaches respect not with fear, but with limits that cannot be negotiated away at the next fundraiser. The father knows how to build such limits. He knows who to call. He also knows that the line between protection and escalation is razor thin. He decides to walk it like a wire and not fall. He speaks a name into a phone. A network hums awake. Not a network of rage, but of order. The kind of order that keeps predators from mistaking neighborhoods for hunting grounds. The kind of order that makes men pause before they lift a hand they should not. He gives instructions stripped of flourish and filled with boundary. No one is to touch the bully. No one is to menace his family. No one is to vandalize his home or haunt his steps. Instead, every door he expects to open will pause. Every job he expects to keep will re-examine standards. Every bar stool that always had his imprint will wobble beneath him. Access will thin. Privilege will thin. The world will not crush him. It will simply refuse to bend around him. The boy watches his father's face as he speaks and learns another lesson. That strength is not always loud. That justice can be quiet and relentless. He leans back and closes his eyes and lets the rhythm of the road settle his breath. The father ends the call and stares ahead at a city that will always be a negotiation between hope and harm. They turn onto a block where their home sits like a promise at the end of a long sentence. The mother waits at the door, her posture a story of worry turned to relief. The boy steps out and into her arms, allowing himself to be small again, if only for a heartbeat. The father stands back, letting the ritual complete, then joins, forming a triangle that has weathered storms before and will weather more. Inside, the train set waits. The boy builds a track that circles and crosses and reconnects, engineering loops that ensure no car is ever stranded. He sets the engine in motion and watches it complete round after round without incident. Control returns to his world in small, clacking increments. The mother watches the train and then her son, understanding the medicine he has chosen. The father watches them both and returns to the phone he hoped not to use today. Circles spin within circles. The bully sits in a holding pattern that will end sooner than justice demands. Already composing the story he will tell to friends and strangers, crafting a version where he is the one unfairly handled. The father's network moves without noise, adjusting levers that determine who sits comfortably in public places and who does not. The waitress drafts a statement in her mind and decides to deliver it in person rather than trust an email that could be ignored. The officers file their paperwork with a care born of recent reckonings and private regrets. Evening leaks into the city like ink. Lights bloom in windows. Somewhere, a coach calls time on practice. Somewhere, a mother folds laundry and wonders if her son will always return with the same light in his eyes. Somewhere, a bully rereads contacts and begins to understand that apologies delivered to the void are not the same thing as repair. The boy finishes the final lap of the train and looks up. He does not cry. He does not smile. He looks forward. He asks a question without words. The father answers with action. Tomorrow will bring the next chapter, a meeting, a reckoning, a test of what justice looks like when it comes from a man who refuses to let his child carry harm alone. Tonight brings rest, and the understanding that rest itself is resistance in a world that tries to keep some people perpetually braced. The camera of our story pulls back through the window, across the street, past the diner where a new sign will go up promising welcome that must be proven. It keeps pulling until the city is a grid of glow and shadow. In the space between those lights, the next decision gathers, and as the night settles, one truth hangs in the air like a held breath. The slap was a spark. But the fire that follows will decide whether this city belongs to men who feed on fear, or to fathers who teach their children that love and limits, together, are stronger than hate. Cliffhanger. Dawn will open a door the bully never expected to find closed, and the boy will learn what justice looks like when it wears a suit, speaks softly, and refuses to blink. Morning arrived with the kind of brittle light that makes even safe streets feel temporary. The city seemed to have learned the story overnight, and then argued with itself in whispers. Coffee shops hummed with half-truths. Group chats pulsed. A handful of voices called the slap a misunderstanding, another handful called it a symptom, and too many measured their outrage against convenience. By noon, a plan was moving through the day like a shadow that touched every corner. The father had requested a meeting at the Community Safety Board, a place where policy wore a smile and accountability pretended to live. He asked for it not to perform, but to force the city to pick a side in daylight. The building that hosted the board was polished and bright, with glass that reflected the sky as if to borrow legitimacy from its color. The lobby filled with people who carried pieces of the story. Neighbors who had seen the boy for years, patrons who knew the diner's rhythm, strangers who arrived because injustice had finally sounded like something that could not be ignored. The waitress from Maple Street stood near the back, hands folded around a folder so tightly the edges curled. The boy clutched his backpack, the zipper pull warm from his thumb, the presence of his mother at one shoulder and his father at the other, turning his small body into a bridge between fear and courage. Down the block, the bully gathered his own crowd. He arrived wearing confidence like armor, flanked by men who preferred echoes to arguments. He had spent the night manufacturing a version of events that cast him as aggrieved, not aggressive. Connections were called. Favors were tugged like old ropes. A cousin in uniform promised to keep things even. A council aide promised to introduce a question that would muddy water long enough to reduce harm to a footnote. The bully rehearsed the shrug he would deploy when cameras found him, the shrug designed to make cruelty look like confusion. Inside the boardroom, the seating formed a neat horseshoe that suggested order. The microphones stared up like small mouths waiting to be fed. Placards with names announced the authority of people who had spent a lifetime learning how to sound neutral. The board members took their places in a practiced choreography. Their smiles were the same width. Their pens were the same weight. Their eyes avoided the swelling on the boy's cheek because seeing it, too, clearly would require rearranging the agenda. The father entered with the grace of a man who understood that every step would be analyzed. He chose a suit darker than night and a tie that did not draw attention. Beside him, the boy wore the same cardigan from the diner, washed and smoothed as if to convince the day that innocence does not wrinkle. A few seats behind them, two men from the father's quiet network stood with their hands folded, expressionless as architecture. Their presence was not threat. It was certainty. They were there to make sure the room stayed honest long enough for truth to breathe. The first minutes felt like a ritual, meant to drain urgency. Remarks were read. Timelines were recited. Deliberation disguised delay. Then the board called the parties forward, and the air changed. The waitress moved first. She placed her folder on the table with hands that shook and then stilled. She spoke in the plain way of people who have no patience for theater. She described the laugh that cut the room. She described the stare that tried to relocate a child from belonging to intrusion. She described the slap that sliced the morning and the sound that lived in the diner after it. She described the boy's stillness and the man's smirk and the way the room became a measuring stick for everyone inside it. When she finished, she held the silence like a line she would not let anyone cross. The bully's cousin in uniform approached next, clipboard crisp, voice even. He described a disturbance and the need to maintain peace. He talked about unclear sequences and competing accounts. He mentioned the father's presence in a way that made it sound like gravity had entered the room, not protection. He did not mention the trembling hands that pressed a napkin to a child's cheek. He did not mention the chocolate stains that refused to fade. He did not mention the peculiar quality of laughter that turns into a weapon. His calm dared the room to accept a version of events that was frictionless and sacrificial at the same time. Then the bully took his turn. He presented himself as a man blindsided by chaos. He conjured a blur in which he looked like a target of misunderstanding. He leaned on the myth that anger has no origin when it lives inside certain men, that it erupts from nowhere and therefore belongs to no one. He gestured to his friends, who nodded as if nodding could alter the weight of a hand landing on a child's face. He referenced a neighbor who would vouch for him, a coach who would attest to his temper being manageable, a donor who found him charming at fundraisers. He smiled as though the room might forget the diner's geometry if he repeated enough friendly names. The father did not interrupt. He looked not at the bully, but at the boy. He kept his eyes steady in a way that told his son that the narrative had not left their hands. When the board invited him to speak, he moved forward and rested his palms lightly on the table, a gesture that made the surface look like water he could calm. He described the world as he had taught it to his son. Stand tall, do not fold, choose composure as a tool, seek justice without letting rage take your name. He described the door chime and the measure of each step, the calculation that replaced panic, the math of protection every parent understands. He did not boast. He did not posture. He let the room understand that power not tethered to principle is just noise. Someone at the far end of the horseshoe cleared a throat and asked for evidence. The waitress straightened and slid an envelope across the table. Inside rested a small drive that held the diner's unblinking memory. She had taken it at closing after a night of scrubbing floors that refused to forget. She had guarded it like a candle against wind. The board's counsel took it, lips pursed around procedure. Technicians were summoned to tame technology. Screens flickered. The room leaned forward into the glow. The first seconds were harmless. Red booths, chrome edges, sunlight fractured by blinds. Then the bully appeared in the frame like a stain blooming. The child in his cardigan became a focal point around which a grown man arranged his cruelty. The camera had no reason to lie. It recorded the angles, the preferences, the posture that precedes harm. It recorded the slap. It recorded the way the boy held his breath and the way the room failed him. It recorded the father entering the frame not as a storm, but as a tide whose pull no one could mistake. It recorded restraint that would not make headlines because restraint is a quiet language. The video ended. The room released a sound that wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a moan, more like the exhale of people who realize they have no more excuses. The bully's mouth worked around denial, then around disdain, then around something like fear. He reached for his cousin's presence like a rope. The cousin shifted in his chair, suddenly learning how heavy a badge can be when a camera refuses to absolve. In that moment, a door at the back of the room opened to a different kind of weather. A crowd had gathered in the corridor, word having spread the way truth sometimes does when it grows too large for whispers. Phones rose, not to turn pain into spectacle, but to document a process that had so often turned against people who looked like the boy. Among them were elders who had carried decades of similar rooms in their bones, and teenagers who had learned that history walks faster than textbooks. The corridor's noise seeped into the boardroom, a low human thunder that reminded everyone that this was not simply a case. It was a mirror. The board conferred in hushed voices, faces tight with the awkwardness of people who had been planning to choreograph both sides' neutrality, but now found the floor tilting. One member suggested a recess. Another suggested a review. A third used the word unfortunate, the way institutions do when they want harm to sound accidental. The mother's hands tightened on the boy's shoulders. The father's jaw set, not in anger, but in resolve. Then the worst possibility entered the room in the oldest disguise, the suggestion that the child and his father had escalated by their very presence. That control maintained by the wrong people makes the right people look dangerous. It came disguised as a question about why the father had not left immediately after removing his son from harm. It came as a proposal to balance consequences, as if scales break unless a victim is weighed down to match his aggressor. The father did not look at the board when this was said. He looked at the boy, who looked back at him with eyes that had learned overnight how to parse cowardice. The moment extended like a bridge over a canyon. The boy felt the weight of the world trying to rewrite his morning into mutual conflict. He felt how quickly stories can be stolen, How quickly blame can be shared when truth feels sharp. The room held its breath. Before the line could harden into policy, the lobby erupted. A fluctuation in the hallway turned into motion. The doors swung wider. The crowd spilled in, not chaotically, but as if pushed by a moral tide. At the front was a woman with silver hair and a spine straight as a flagpole. She carried a box of paper that smelled like an archive. She had lived long enough to lose friends to lies, and she had learned to keep receipts. She placed the box on the table with the care one uses for relics. Inside were affidavits from patrons, statements from staff, images of the boy's cheek taken immediately after, and years of complaints filed about the bully for smaller harms that had never crossed the threshold of consequence. It was not just one morning anymore. It was a pattern. It was a map. The board's veneer cracked under the pressure of documented truth. A few members leaned toward accountability as if basking in rare sunlight. Others tried to calibrate their expressions to signal care without surrendering control. The bully's smirk faltered, then broke. He turned toward the doors in a reflex older than integrity. The cousin in uniform rose, either to guide or to shield, the difference thin as a piece of paper. The crowd stepped aside, not out of deference, but to let the truth finish its work, and then the room snapped. Not in violence, but in understanding. An elder near the back lifted a hand and pointed to the boy, not as an accusation, but as a compass. The gesture spread like a signal. People pivoted, attention aligned around the child who had been the center all along. The father felt the movement like a subtle change in wind. For months, he had operated in quiet, moving levers that reshape outcomes without public applause. Here, the city was discovering a different lever. Collective clarity. He stepped back half a pace, creating space for the boy to be seen not as a symbol for a man's power, but as a person for whom the room existed. The chair of the board finally found language that was not cowardly. Policy was cited not to obfuscate, but to anchor action. The bully would face immediate suspension from the places he had used as stages for his temperament. The case would be referred to a prosecutor who had been publicly embarrassed once before for dismissing charges in a similar incident. Shame can sometimes be rehabilitative. The precinct would initiate an internal review of the cousin's earlier report. The diner would receive city support for trauma-informed de-escalation training, real training, not the check-the-box kind. The boy's family would be offered resources, but not as hush money, not as appeasement, as acknowledgement. Words like that matter. In a different time, this might have been the end. But the climax is not a set of announcements. It is the moment before the next knife falls. Someone shouted from the corridor. The word threat cut the air. A surge of bodies tilted the room. The bully's friends, who had been lingering near the elevators, had decided that humiliation insisted on spectacle of their own. They spilled into the hall with loud voices and the posture of men who mistake disruption for courage. In their hands were signs made minutes ago with markers that bled. The words were old, dressed in fresh ink, accusing the father of menace, accusing the board of surrender, accusing the boy of manipulation. A chant tried to take root, ugly and sloppy. Security moved to form a thin cordon that shook like a rope pulled from both ends. The cousin in uniform stepped into the hall and raised a hand that might have calmed things earlier in the day, but now looked like a plea for a pause that no one would grant. The glass wall between boardroom and corridor turned the scene into an aquarium of agitation. The boy took a step closer to the father, whose hand came to rest lightly on his shoulder. A physical period at the end of a sentence that read, "You are not alone." Phones rose again, this time not to document a process, but to ward off the worst outcomes. Even men who intend harm sometimes hesitate when too many lenses watch. The bully, caged by the geometry of a narrow hallway and the sudden shape of his shrinking world, did what cornered pride does. He lunged at the only target that would still make him feel large. His shoulder dropped, his jaw clenched, and he moved in a direction that stung the room with recognition. It wasn't toward the father. It was toward the boy. The father covered distance that should have been impossible to cover in a few heartbeats. He did not shove. He did not strike. He placed himself between. He absorbed the momentum like a banked curve receives speed and converts it into direction. The bully's chest met a wall of intention. The contact was brief and decisive. The cousin reached too late to refract the truth. Security closed ranks. The crowd inhaled, a single lung intending to scream or to pray or to both. Sirens pitched higher outside, a chorus that made the floor vibrate. The bullies' friends, sensing the chapter ending badly for them, tried to turn retreat into strategy. Some dropped their signs. Some held their chins higher as if height alone were dignity. For a moment, it looked like the worst thing about to happen would be paperwork and the slow turning of institutional cogs. Then a trick of adrenaline nearly tipped the scene into history. A hand at the edge of the corridor reached for a waist where something metal flashed. The moment became microscope tight. The father's eyes measured distance, trajectory, timing. The boy felt the center of the world contract to the square of tile under his shoes. The cousin's hand moved toward his holster out of training and fear. 3 security officers pivoted, one foot lifting, the other planting. A woman in the crowd threw her body between the arc of a potential weapon and the small rectangle of space where a child stood. She was not a protester. She was a grandmother. She had 7 seconds left on her courage before fear would claim her breath. The metal flashed again and turned, revealing a phone whose chrome case impersonated a threat. The owner's face paled as he realized he had nearly turned performance into a funeral. He raised both hands, the phone trapped between fingers like a moth. The cousin's hand froze 2 inches from a mistake. The grandmother's chest heaved as relief crashed into delayed terror. The father's shoulders dropped a fraction as his body wrote a new logbook entry under a heading labeled Almost. The boardroom door opened and swallowed the boy. His mother and the father back inside, not as retreat but as recentering. The crowd adjusted, drawing a protective circle without instruction. The waitress found her way to the family and placed a hand on the boy's other shoulder, steady as a beam. It was then that the last piece of the climax slid into place. Silent but final. The city had watched the same moment from 2 angles, the camera's and its own, and had learned that it preferred the angle where the child lived. A hush fell that was not surrender but decision. Officers replaced cousins. Process replaced promises. The bully was guided away with the deliberate pace of consequence. His friends faded, their chant withering now that the oxygen of spectacle was gone. The grandmother steadied. The crowd exhaled the breath it had been holding since the first milkshake shattered. Some people cried. Others let their shoulders drop the way people do when a weight they didn't know they carried lifts a little. The board reconvened, not to deliberate, but to declare. Measures were read into the record that would outlast the news cycle. A formal censure, a referral with teeth, a public apology that would land on the front page not as a victory lap, but as a marker. An initiative shaped by actual witnesses, not consultancy decks, to train staff in spaces where power meets service, where subtle cruelties metastasize into violence. For once, a city remembered that policy is not paperwork. It is the nervous system of daily life. The father listened and let the words flow over him like water he did not plan to drink until he saw if the source was clean. The boy's hand found his father's and held it unashamed. He had survived the worst of a lesson he never asked to learn. He had also learned something else. The shock that cuts the world open can let light in if a room refuses to blink. The family turned toward the exit together. The corridor had softened. Strangers offered space. A path appeared where there had been only pressure. Sunlight angled through the glass and warmed the boy's cheek as if to vote for healing. They moved through the lobby like travelers leaving weather behind. The doors opened to a sidewalk where the crowd fractured into smaller circles of conversation, planning, and relief. For a long moment, the city looked like a place that understood its own reflection. A black car eased to the curb. The driver stepped out and held the door with the precision of a ritual. The father paused before guiding his son inside, sensing that the climax was not finished with them yet. He scanned the edges of the crowd, the way men who protect scan for the one thing out of place. Near the corner, a figure stood very still, not a friend, not an obvious threat, holding nothing but a stare. The stare wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even hate. It was calculation. The father recognized it because he had worn it once, in younger years, before he decided his son would never have to read it on his face. He felt the old world press against the new one like tectonic plates considering a rumble. He understood that the day had delivered victory, But the night would bring questions. Power resents being told where it cannot go. It tends to gather in shadows and measure retaliation by the inch rather than the mile. The boy climbed into the car. The mother followed, eyes never leaving the father's back. The father remained with one foot on the sidewalk and one in the car, the posture of a man who knows the hinge between chapters. He held the stare of the still figure until the figure looked away first. Then he stepped into the car and pulled the door shut with the same gentle firmness he had used to end the bully's momentum. The engine started. The city moved. People dispersed into the work of maintaining a world that does not default to harm. The boardroom behind them began to empty of microphones and agendas, but for once it did not empty of responsibility. The car turned into traffic, and the boy leaned his head against the window, letting the rhythm of motion smooth the ragged edge of adrenaline. They passed the diner on Maple Street. The blinds were half open. The red booths shone. A small handwritten sign sat in the window, a promise of welcome that the staff had decided would be earned, not performed. Inside, Doris wiped a table with deliberate care, and when she saw the car pass, she pressed a hand to her chest and allowed herself to breathe. The father's phone vibrated with messages that fell into two categories: support from people who had nothing to gain by offering it, and inquiries from men who spoke fluently in the language of leverage. He muted both and looked at his son instead. The boy met his gaze and nodded, as if to say that he understood that the story had not ended. It had turned. He understood that justice is not a destination, it is a direction. The street widened ahead, sunlight laying a clean stripe down the asphalt. The father reached for the boy's shoulder the way a captain checks a mast. The boy leaned into the touch the way a sail leans into wind. For a few seconds the car felt weightless, the city felt possible, and the day felt like a hinge swinging the right way. Then the light turned red. The car slowed. From the side street, a pair of unmarked vehicles rolled forward just far enough to be felt. Not enough to block, enough to announce presence. The still figure from the corner might not have followed. It didn't have to. Messages travel in lines the eye cannot see. The driver's hands tightened imperceptibly on the wheel. The father saw it all, measured it, and made the smallest motion with his chin, a reminder that fear is allowed to knock but not to enter. The light turned green. The unmarked vehicles held their ground for a beat too long and then eased back. The car moved through the intersection with the calm of a blade slipping through water. The boy watched the side mirror until the shadow was a dot and then a memory. In the quiet that followed, the father knew the truth pressed against the day like a pulse. The worst was not only the slap or the corridor lunge. The worst was the machinery that had almost made them normal. He also knew the best thing that happened had not been his interventions or his network. It had been the room choosing the child. The skyline drew the car toward home. The father's phone vibrated again, one message rising above the noise. It was short. It named a date, a hearing, a judge known for careful hands. It named a witness who had come forward from the bully's past without being asked. It named a chance for something rare, consequence that teaches rather than merely punishes. The father allowed himself a single breath of gratitude and then returned to vigilance. He would accept peace when it was earned. The car turned onto their block. The boy saw his front door and felt safety expand like a lung ready to take a full breath. He reached for the handle and paused, sensing there was one more step before the day could collapse into evening. Across the street, a neighbor stepped onto her porch and lifted a hand in a small salute that meant more than words. Two children on bicycles slowed and watched with eyes that did not understand yet why this family mattered to their futures. A courier set a package down and looked up with the kind of smile people wear when they choose sides and are proud of it. The father stepped out and circled to the sidewalk before opening the door for his son. He did not do it for show. He did it because rituals hold people together when weather changes. The boy climbed out and looked up, past the roofs, toward a strip of sky that had decided to be sincerely blue. He whispered nothing and meant everything. The door to the house opened. Warmth rushed out. The smell of dinner met the edges of a day that had tested every nerve. The mother ushered them inside and closed the world out for a moment. The father lingered on the threshold, reading the air like a man listening for the echo after thunder. Outside, a car idled 2 houses down, ordinary enough to disappear if you wanted it to. The father noticed without staring. He let the door close gently, not as a retreat but as an acceptance that the next chapter would begin on their terms. The city held its breath again, this time not in fear, but in anticipation. And the day ended on a line sharp enough to cut the night. The slap had started a fire, but what burned next would reveal whether this city could finally learn to protect a child without needing a man, like his father, to stand between him and the world. Night loosened its grip on the city and left a quieter morning behind. The kind of morning that arrives after a storm and asks softly whether you learned anything. The house on the corner breathed like a living thing. Inside, the boy woke before the alarm, not startled, not shaking, but changed in a way he could feel from the inside out. He pressed a palm to his cheek and felt only the faintest memory of a bruise. The real mark lived deeper, not as a wound, but as a new layer of bone. He dressed slower than usual, choosing the cardigan not because he wanted to remember, but because he wanted to reclaim. When he came to the kitchen, his mother slid a bowl across the table with a smile that reached her eyes this time. His father poured coffee with the measured calm of a man who knows storms will return but trusts the roof he has built. The boy ate, not with the frantic hunger that follows fear, but with a steadiness that signaled repair. He listened to the clink of spoon against bowl, the low hum of the refrigerator, the soft thud of his father's newspaper folding and refolding. Ordinary sounds became proof that life can hold pain and still move in rhythm. He set the bowl down and watched the morning light step across the floorboard gaps like a careful dancer, and he understood something he could not yet say. Survival is not just making it through. It is deciding what the day will mean. They returned to the diner that afternoon, not for spectacle, for closure. The red booths were the same. The bell over the door still chimed with that familiar little ring. The scent of coffee and syrup hung in the air like a promise kept. The waitress wiped her hands and came out from behind the counter with a look that mixed apology, pride, and relief. The boy took his seat by the window and wrapped both hands around a fresh milkshake. The glass was cold, the straw steady, the sweetness exactly as he remembered. The chocolate stripes on the floor had been scrubbed away, but the room carried a new gravity, a collective understanding that welcome means nothing until it holds under pressure. Other patrons noticed without staring. Some nodded. Some straightened their shoulders as if their spines had learned a lesson. A father near the door placed a gentle hand on his daughter's head and seemed to breathe easier. The waitress moved with more purpose than the day before. She refilled cups, but she also refilled the room's courage. She had given testimony when silence would have been safer. She had risked the comfort of being overlooked. People saw it and adjusted themselves around the truth of it. Across town, consequences began to harden into the shape of accountability. Paperwork gave way to actions that carried weight. The bully was suspended from spaces where he had once performed power. A prosecutor opened a file and chose to read it with clear eyes, not tired ones. An internal report threaded through a precinct and confronted a cousin with the difference between loyalty and integrity. None of it moved as quickly as outrage or grief, but for once, it moved. The city's nervous system, so often numb when the harm looks familiar, felt the signal and responded. The father did not declare victory. He understood that what looks like an ending is often just a bend in the road. He attended to smaller things that matter more than declarations. He checked the route his son would take to school. He spoke quietly with a principal who listened with attention rather than defensiveness. He made notes about a policy at the diner to reduce the chance that one person's temper could hold a room hostage again. He called people not to threaten, but to set boundaries with clarity. He asked for training that wasn't theater. He asked for signage that meant something. He asked for procedures that would protect the next child whether or not a powerful parent happened to be nearby. At home, the boy built a longer train track. He added a double loop that crossed itself, a bridge that could bear more weight, a switch that offered a safer detour. He watched the engine navigate his new design and felt a quiet pride in the adjustments. He was learning what his father already knew. Strength is not just the ability to stop a blow. It is the wisdom to design a world where fewer blows are thrown. The days that followed arranged themselves into a pattern that did not erase what happened, but refused to let it command everything. School returned with spelling words and fractions, and the gentle noise of children who do not yet know how brave they are. A teacher moved through the classroom with new attention to who sits where and who needs an extra glance of reassurance. A guidance counselor reached out to the family not with forms to be signed, but with a willingness to listen and to offer real resources. The boy learned to speak about the incident without reliving it in a way that stole his breath. He learned to let people see what happened without letting them define him by it. The father returned to his other work, the work that keeps wolves from front porches. He did not dissolve as a shadow into the next conflict. He stood more clearly in daylight than he had in years. He realized something unexpected. The city had seen him protect without punishing indiscriminately. The city had watched him refuse to turn a child into a symbol and refuse to let a bully become a martyr. That clarity pulled certain men out of the shadows, men who had used their networks to bend rules because no one had asked them to bend them toward anything but themselves. Some withdrew, uneasy with a power that demanded limits. Some leaned in, surprised to find in the father not just a steward of consequence, but a builder of durable safeguards, the bully. Left to sit with the version of himself that cameras cannot flatter, arrived at a junction that every person who has done harm eventually finds. One path offered a familiar escape, denial dressed as confusion, a new story to perform for a new audience. The other path offered something heavier and therefore more valuable, repair. He resisted repair the way a stubborn door resists a new key, but the old keys no longer turned. Doors that had always opened paused. Rooms that once welcomed now required more. Men who had laughed at his jokes no longer found them funny. He could feel the net of consequence tightening not around his throat, but around his excuses. It did not choke him. It simply refused to carry him. He began to write letters that did not ask for sympathy. He sought counsel from people who would not let him rehearse his grievances as gospel. He stood in a room with people he had harmed in smaller, less public ways and listened without correction. He discovered what many discover too late, that the hardest part of repair is not saying sorry. It is surrendering the need to be seen as the kind of man who never needed to. Whether he completed the work or quit halfway is not the center of this story. The center of this story is the boy and the city bending together toward something sturdier. The board, the one with microphones and careful smiles, met again. This time, the agenda did not avoid the weight of what had happened. This time, the policies proposed had teeth and timelines. The waitress spoke again, not only as a witness, but as a citizen who expects better from rooms where rules are made. Elders offered context that stretched decades, anchoring the board's urgency to a history that refuses to be edited out. Young people translated that urgency into steps they could take: training sign-ups, mutual aid lists, a map of safe spaces created by the community rather than promised by a brochure. The diner put up a new sign, not the kind that announces tolerance as if it were a special feature, but the kind that conveys commitment to practice. Staff learned to spot the early signals of harm, the posture that precedes cruelty, the laughter that sharpens rather than softens, the circle that forms around a small target. Staff learned how to interrupt without escalating, how to script phrases that anchor a room back to safety, how to call for help in a way that does not put the victim at further risk. The boy's milkshake became a ritual again, but now it carried the extra sweetness of a community that had decided to be brave on purpose. The wider city adjusted its mirrors. Parents looked longer at their children at the end of the day and asked better questions. Coaches talked to their teams not just about discipline on a field, but dignity off it. Bar owners posted codes of conduct that did not vanish after the first round. Teachers folded small lessons into big ones about how to be in public and how to be with each other. Clergy mentioned the incident without sensationalizing it, using the moment as a way to pull people toward the work of prevention rather than the spectacle of punishment alone. News cycles tried to spin out, as they always do, but the story did not lend itself to the usual flattening. There was a powerful man, yes, and there were men who had deferred to him in fear and respect. There was a child who became a target and then a center. There was footage, and there were phones, and there was a hallway that almost turned into a headline no one could bear. But embedded within all of that was a quieter fact that proved stubbornly hopeful. A room chose the child. A city looked at the angle that protected him and decided it preferred that angle going forward. The boy felt the shift most clearly in the subtle places. He noticed a crossing guard greet him with a warmth that conveyed both welcome and watchfulness. He noticed another child sit beside him at lunch who had never done so before, not out of pity but out of recognition. He noticed his own breathing deepen on the walk home. He did not become fearless. He became anchored. Fear still visited, but it no longer chose his seat. At night, he kept the cardigan folded on a chair by his bed, not as a relic, as a reminder that he could wear his own story without letting it wear him. He thought more often about the names on the mural they had passed after the board meeting. He learned a few, not because adults told him to, but because he wanted to understand the burden and the blessing of being part of a lineage of survival. He began to see his train set as more than a toy. It became a map, a lesson in how to design routes that protect the small and guide the fast. The father watched his son and edited his own story too. He had built a life around control, around stepping into the space where institutions fail and steering outcomes towards safety for the people he loved. He did not abandon that role. The world had not earned that kind of trust yet, but he widened it. He invited people in who were not part of his old networks but had proven faithfulness in public ways. He learned to accept a different kind of help, the kind that comes from neighbors, teachers, nurses, elders, from all the unsung hands that hold a city upright when storms lean on it. He also realized something private but profound. The best legacy he could give his son was not invincibility. It was community. A room full of strangers had held the line with them. A grandmother had thrown her body into a nearly tragic misunderstanding and kept the story from breaking. A waitress had left the shelter of politeness and stood squarely in truth. This coalition was not an accident. It was the outcome of daily choices to notice, to intervene, to risk small comforts to protect a larger peace. Eventually, a court date arrived, and it did not feel like entertainment. It felt like maintenance. The bully appeared not as a villain to be destroyed, but as a citizen to be held and educated by consequences. A judge with careful hands set terms that included restitution, community work measured in hours, not headlines, mandatory learning guided by people who do not owe patience, but often give it anyway. The outcome disappointed those who measure justice only by the size of a hammer. It encouraged those who measure it by the sturdiness of the community afterward. It did not fix everything. It did begin to close a chapter without waiting for time to do all the work. As the months unspooled, the incident stopped being a constant topic and became something both lighter and heavier, a reference point. People used it to ask better questions in other rooms. When somebody laughed the wrong way, someone else remembered the diner and chose to step forward sooner. When a policy draft blurred the edges of responsibility, a board member thought of the boy's cardigan and insisted on clarity. When a child hesitated at a threshold that felt unwelcome, a stranger extended a hand and made space. That is impact. When a single morning echoes into a city's evening habits. The boy grew. He did not become a speech on legs. He became himself with more certainty. He learned a sport and played it with joy. He read more than he did before, not to escape the world, but to name it. He learned that history does not live only in thick books. It lives in small choices at counters and doorways and meetings where microphones wait. He learned to be gentle and firm at the same time, the way his father had been when he moved the air around a bully without breaking it. On the anniversary of the day the milkshake shattered, they returned to Maple Street. The bell chimed again. The room looked back at them with the memory of both sorrow and repair. The waitress brought a milkshake without being asked. The father took his coffee, the mother her tea. Other patrons smiled in that unpracticed way that belongs only to honest moments. For a few minutes, the world felt almost simple. Then the father stood and asked the room for something it had already begun to give. A promise. Not in words spoken aloud, but in daily practice. A promise to notice. A promise to step in. A promise to remember that justice is not an event, but a posture. The city did not transform overnight into a blueprint of fairness. But it did what real places do when they learn. It practiced. It practiced on ordinary days when no cameras watched and no board convened. It practiced at bus stops and school fronts and in lobbies where people used to whisper and now choose to speak. Practice is not glamorous. Practice is how the next milkshake stays in the child's hand. Practice is how a father can sit down for a full cup of coffee. This is where the story lands. Not with a final victory lap, but with a living call. Because the truth is simple and hard at once. What happened to this boy was not an accident in a vacuum. It was a symptom of a deeper architecture. And yet, the way people responded built a different scaffold in real time. That's the blueprint worth copying. So here is the invitation that lingers after the credits would normally roll. Look around the spaces you move through every day. The diner, the hallway, the sideline, the boardroom, the sidewalk outside your home. Ask yourself who is welcome there because everyone should be, and who is only safe there because someone like this father happened to walk in. If the answer depends on luck, change the structure until it depends on practice. If this story stirred something in you, let that feeling become a choice. Share the story, yes, but also share responsibility. Start a conversation at your local school or cafe about how to interrupt small harms before they become big ones. Volunteer for the dull parts of justice, training, policy review, showing up to listen when it's easier not to. Support the witnesses who step forward. Check in on the children who learned too early how to scan a room. Celebrate the quiet protectors who build limits and love in equal measure. Vote for the people who write rules with the most vulnerable person in mind. Offer your presence when cameras are gone. Because in the end, the most powerful moment was not when the father stood between the boy and a bully, as necessary and heroic as that was. The most powerful moment was when a room full of people stood between the boy and a system that almost called his pain a tie. That is a posture we can all learn. That is a muscle a city can strengthen. He made it home that night, not unchanged, but unbroken. He made it back to the diner, not to relive the harm, but to reclaim the joy. He made it into a room that chose him, not because his father was feared, but because his life was valued. The fear and humiliation did not vanish. They became fuel for better habits, and he is not alone. This is not just one story. It is a mirror reflecting millions, a mirror that asks every time a bell rings and a room falls quiet. Will we wait for a powerful man to walk in, or will we become the kind of community that does not need him? The next time a laugh sharpens, the next time a stare turns territorial, the next time a child's shoulders tighten, the next time a board hesitates, what will you do? If this moved you, let it move you into motion. Share this story so others feel the weight and the hope. Leave your thoughts so the conversation keeps breathing. Take one step today, however small, toward building a room that chooses the child. Because justice is a direction, not a finish line. And every ordinary day is a chance to aim the city that way, together.